In regards to Al-Qaeda and ISIS, do you have a response to people who say, well, that's not what Islam is? Those are just like fanatics and they shouldn't be associated with each other?
I do. And I think what's become very clear to me over the years is there are a lot of really good people who are Muslim and who are really virulently opposed to the actions of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The problem is that when leaders of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, when they invoke the Quran or they invoke the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, those invocations are more consistent with their actions than the good Muslims who are saying, we reject violence, we reject force, we reject intolerance, and we embrace freedom and equality.
Okay, yeah, so essentially her question is Islam inherently violent because of the actions of Al-Qaeda, of Daesh or ISIS, as known in the West, and a number of other kind of extreme groups within the Islamic communities or Muslim communities. So if I just start with Noura, what was your kind of feeling coming out of that question, and then we'll dive into a couple of statistics.
I think it was the emotional way. It was like, these people have known nothing about Islam, and we saw, I think, after ISIS obviously has been just scattered around, about, and then the situation has happened now that many people have actually left ISIS, and they had a couple of interviews with previous ISIS members, and they really did not know a thing about what Islam is about and what were they actually doing, what's behind their actions, why are they behaving in that certain way. So it's really not Islam. Islam is really not violent. I think if we go back to the Quran and the Hadith, there's one ayah, that one verse that came straight away when that happened, is that it says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, وَإِذَا خَاطَبَهُمُ الْجَاهِلُونَ قَالُوا سَلَامًا. It's like when the ignorant address them, they say peace. And I don't know how can that say that Islam is inherently violence when someone passes by you and obviously says something that you wouldn't like to you, and then you say peace to them. How is that saying and that it's just violent?
How beautifully was that exemplified by the Holy Prophet, the founder of Islam, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, in his entire kind of 13 years in Mecca, where he was persecuted and tortured, his family, everything, beyond what most of us can even imagine, and no response, no retaliation. He wasn't authorized by Allah to be violent back towards his persecutors. So even from those beginning roots, and categorically in Islam, in the Quran, it has been said to, say peace back, to respond in a peaceful, law-abiding way. I mean, even, but drawing onto that, the fact that the Prophet, peace be upon him, in the first 13 years, as you say, was persecuted, but actually going further than that, when he became the winner, as it were, in terms of when he conquered Mecca, and he became he became the leader of Mecca at that time. What did he do? He forgave those people who had persecuted him and his family, who eventually, who led to the death of his uncle, the death of his beloved wife, and he chose, to forgive them. He didn't go on a rampage to, get his retribution. When he was at the pinnacle where he could enact all of those retribution, against those people who had committed those things against him, he didn't do that. He forgave them. So, I mean, if we're supposed to be using the Prophet, peace be upon him, as our example, what an amazing example to go by. And then just, there's a huge population in the world that are Muslim, right? If Islam was inherently violent, what kind of world would we be living in? Would we be able to live in any kind of peace? Absolutely not. I mean, I think it's quite clear when we look to our day-to-day lives that we are striving for peace. We're striving for a peaceful society. And how can Muslims juxtapose or justify that with their faith if it's meant to be violent?
And I think in that kind of like area as well, if Islam is violent as well, if we see the Islamic countries, like for example Syria is majority Muslims, Egypt are majority Muslims as well, if Islam is violent, then they wouldn't actually accept non-Muslims to live there. But we can see there's so many people of different faiths, and there's so many people that are living happily without actually having to follow what exactly the Muslims are. So it's just living coherently and then living happily with each other. That's another part of having that peaceful environment, and what Islam tells us to do.
It's interesting that Ayaan has picked up on the voice of those extremists that she, in Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and said that actually what they're saying is more cohesive with what Islam says. And then in the same breath, she says, but every Muslim that says that is negating this is wrong. So she's cherry-picked out what she wants to push as her narrative. It's so clear in that clip.
Yeah, absolutely. And she does what a lot of people do, which where they're quite anti-Islam, and we've seen it a number of times in the UK with speakers who essentially, as you say, cherry pick various groups and their opinions and try and twist who in themselves will try and twist Islamic values to kind of benefit their own political agenda, because it is all political agenda. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, even the Taliban, etc. They have a political agenda, and they use Islam to try and justify and meet their means to the end, essentially. And a number of extremist groups in other communities as well have done the same thing, but we don't point the finger at them and say this is inherently within Christianity. So
if we're saying if in the same breath, if she is saying Islam is inherently violent, then we have to paint every other religion. Well, we have to paint Christianity, with that same brush, because, we know the history there.
In the US in particular as well, with like the far right extremists and things.
Exactly,
and I mean, I know I'm just pointing to you because you have an American accent. But I know you were born in the US, so there are far right extremist elements who use Christianity to justify mass killing of people, groups of communities.
But do they say that then Christianity is inherently violent?
No, of course they don't. They say that he's got mental health problems. That's what they say. So, yes, I think just before I leave this point, there was an article I read quite a while ago in which it was talking about the specific, quote, problem of Muslims in France, and the fact that the French were really struggling with this idea of trying to integrate the Muslim community within France. That's been a debate that's been going on for so long. And actually looking at the statistics, more than around 56 to 60% of the Muslim population in France and across Europe actually would have said that they are practicing Muslims. So, there are hundreds of thousands of Muslims in Europe. So if we see ourselves as being practicing Muslims, but Islam is inherently violent, then we would have a huge problem, a huge problem on our hand in Europe. But that's not the case. Just putting that to bed.